Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review a movie called Severance. Evidently, for some reason or another, I just keep finding movies that are usually on HBO Max. But this movie is also to be on Vudu for free, VUDU. If you've never been in Vudu before, you can easily go into Vudu and not have to pay any kind of fee or anything like that, and watch a slew of movies for absolutely free. There's like a whole entire section that is just like for people that don't want to pay a dollar or a dime, and you can watch like free movies uh, that are at some points like something that, hey, I want to check this out. Yeah, because I've been in Vudu before. I've had to look for specific movies and titles and whatever, and now I was kind of very blown away by eventually what you could eventually find in Vudu once you kind of search for a while, or once you eventually try to like find something in there. So with that said, for some reason, and this isn't going to be the exact same kind of movie, but it's quasi similar. I think the real thing that attracted me to this movie is because I had seen another film called Mayhem that was done in 2017, which has a lot of familiar Walking Dead faces, where there is to be all of a sudden this office building that ends up closing in upon itself, and then all of a sudden you have all of these office characters going ahead and killing one another, because eventually there is supposed to be a specific number of people left alive, and whoever is to be left alive at the end of this is to eventually be able to go home. And that movie was really interesting. And so when I was to kind of go into this film, there was this kind of thing here where you have a bunch of office people who end up going into this seemingly cabin of the woods kind of situation, where all these people end up getting stuck in the middle of nowhere, and so they eventually end up deciding that there is something quite off about the place that they are supposed to be in, and they eventually find out that there is some threats here that are to or terrorists, or just people going ahead and killing other people just because they can, because they're in this environment. They're kind of terrorists at some point. It kind of just reminds me of maybe like either a Wrong Turn, excuse me, or like a Cabin in the Woods kind of situation. And so kind of just enjoyed it. There is one big fault with this movie also. There's a problem with this movie that I just kind of find annoying, is because they like to tease sex moments. That's the only problem that I really have with this film, is they like to tease that, oh, a woman's going to take off her top. Oh, some woman is going to be displayed in her bed, and all you're going to see is her like backside, and that's about it. And eventually we're assuming or assessing that eventually somewhere in this movie there's going to be this big huge payout, because they've kind of been trickling and teasing all this stuff throughout this film. And then eventually we just get this kind of chintzy payout of a 20 to 30-second woman topless, and we're just supposed to be fine with that. But the teasing part of it is kind of interesting. It's kind of fun. But I just also find it annoying. I'm sorry, if you're gonna give me something, give me something. If you're not gonna don't tease the crap out of people. That is just an awful thing. And plus also, it kind of is to say, what audience are you trying to get here? Are you trying, evidently you must not be going for the female audience, you're just going for a male audience, or females that like females, but still, what kind of thing are you approaching here? What kind of thing are you doing here? But anyways, going with this movie, so I would say that this movie is a solid, I would say it's a solid, almost good movie. I would say almost good, just because reasonably, there's just a lot of times where people are just kind of just standing around, or just sitting around, just kind of waiting to eventually die. The villains aren't even all that great. I wish that there would have been some real legitimate like story about this, or I kind of wish that these people all would have just started to just go crazy and kill one another off. Or maybe you would have found out that the boss, hence why this is called Severance, is to have killed everyone off because of really everyone was going to get fired anyways, and also he couldn't have the heart to tell all of them that they were getting fired. So maybe like there could have been a much more interesting story here, but they decided to not really give us a good story. They just decided to just chuck people in a certain location and eventually slowly but surely have that pay out eventually. um I think the very beginning of this movie will get you excited to go further into this film. Uh, I think reasonably, like when I started watching this film, like it kind of reminded me of uh, the the one God, what is it? The one movie Hunt, where I was thinking like, what is all of a sudden people are just going to be dropped into this area and then they're just going to get hunted? Like, is that what's going to happen? But no, like it's kind of a slow trickle process, and it also seems that eventually these people end up getting killed just because they end up accidentally into an environment because they couldn't have read a map correctly. Is that what we'd also have to naturally assume? That these people just randomly ended up getting killed because they went to the wrong luxury spot, evidently. So yeah, this movie is like I would say it's a solid okay film. Just because really, I wish there was a better story. Like you can only go so far with the concept of it, but there has to be something in between, towards the real action parts and just the beginning of the movie to really just be like, okay, like there's a really good story here because there's just this slow trickle of things eventually happening. So, like to me, this almost kind of reminds me of like a poor Friday the 13th movie. That's what it kind of reminds me of, like a Friday the 13th movie. If instead of having like the camp counselors or whatever, you just sent adults to this bizarrish camp that they found out was like this, like man, this camp is really chintzy than we thought. So with that said, let's go into that double five time territory so we can get into spoilers. Let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we spoil this movie. So we have these corporate people that are all going on this weekend retreat, and everybody is already just like, God, I just don't want to do this. Like, I don't care about what we're doing here. It feels obvious that like no one gives a single F about what's really going on. And so we have this kind of like boss character who is to be Richard, who is to see this video of this guy named George, who is to be, I guess, this person who is to be some kind of like Tony Stark Ash like character who evidently creates weapons to forward against terrorism. And so Richard is kind of going to Billy and saying like, "Hey, like, make sure there's a memo sent out to George mentioning how great of a video that he put together." So George ends up doing this video, having this logo about like, if you guys are to see this logo, know that it's to prevent terrorism. Yeah, like eventually we see the only time that we next see that this logo is to be in the hands of the terrorists in this film, uh, garnering in the very end of this movie, or really just at some part where eventually someone is to carve a symbol into someone's stomach, let's just say. So this movie might not be for everyone. So, because, like, the very beginning of what happens in this movie is kind of an out of context kind, or out of the context of what this movie has, because we have in the very beginning of this movie we have this one guy who evidently is George, who's running in the forest, and we have these two women that are barely wearing next to nothing. They're wearing these coats, and then these bikinis, and just basically like they're pretty much just wearing nothing. So they're running through the forest, and all of a sudden the girls drop into this big hole where they're continually taking clothes off to try and see if they can chuck this stick with all their clothes on it to try and get out of this place, chucking it over this hole to try to see if they can latch onto something so they can get out of this hole. And eventually we have one of the girls who turns to the much taller girl and is like, hey, like we're gonna need one more thing of clothing. And basically the only thing the girl has left is like freaking like a bra and panties. So guess which art of clothing is gonna be taken off. So we eventually see the guy who's to spot the women who are just kind of like, hey, help me. And he's like, I'm sorry, I'm gonna run off. So this guy runs off to eventually get into a trap where all of a sudden he gets grabbed by this rope trap, and he gets dangled upside down, and he ends up getting stabbed, and all this blood is flowing upside down in camera frame, and to just introduce us to the movie. So now we're back onto this bus. So we all of a sudden have one character who is to eventually be this guy who is to be called Steve, who the only thing that actually matters to him is getting high of sorts. He is to eat every single one of these mushrooms, and then he's to be this severely paranoid one, where he's to consistently mention that there's someone in the forest when eventually these people are left to eventually go into the forest to eventually find their Airbnb to hunker down. Because what ends up happening without Mushroom Boy, why do we always have in every... Why is there always a movie where somebody has to viciously try to either get drunk or high in a horror film? Why does that always have to be a staple of a thing? Like, I don't quite get why we have to have that be such an important thing for any one of these movies. We have, like, Cabin in the Woods, where, like, the one guy has to get, like, really high. He has this giant bong of a thing. And, like, in Scary Movie, they make fun of, or they have one guy who ends up being the guy that is to consistently be smoking weed, till eventually a weed monster goes and tries to kill him. Because script. So this guy's eat mushrooms, and eventually he is to not quite be sure if he peed his pants or not, and so eventually he at some point while these people are, because here's what happens within this bus ride. So eventually there is to be a big huge batch of logs that are to be in a part of road where this bus driver is supposed to drive on through. And so this guy is like, well, since this part is blocked off, you guys can just walk the rest of the way, because I'm not going to drive any further. I'm not going to come up with any other route to get to where you need to go. You guys are on your own. You guys are on your own. Plus also, oh crap, I forgot to mention, like, there are certain parts about this movie that isn't in English, but there's very small portions of that, and if anything, it doesn't hinder the movie at all by those parts being there. So, because the bus driver doesn't really speak in clear English, but Richard can understand him. So, Richard. So, eventually everyone gets out with all their luggage because the bus driver just starts chucking luggage out of his bus, And so the bus driver's like, later days, because we'll end up finding him later, eventually just hauled out of his bus freaking dead and sliced and diced, and his like bus is all going to be messed up, and eventually Harris is going to drive it back to the people to get the heck out of there, because they're like, dude, we're going to get freaking, like, this is ridiculous, we need to get out of here. So eventually this leads to Richard consistently asking either Gordon or Billy, like, how long do you think that we are actually away from this Airbnb, this bread and breakfast? Like, how far away are we really? Like, because, like, there's probably an inch upon this map. So do you think an inch means a mile? Do you think that we're right there? Like, what does this mean? And so, like, we have Billy, who is to mention, like, well, like, this map might not be exact. We could eventually find that an inch on a map could be like 10 miles, could be like 10,000 miles. We don't know. And so Richard is like, well, I guess we just got to continue walking until we can find this thing. And so eventually we get, obviously, Harris, who's just like, dude, I'm not going to put up with this. Like, I'm going to go back and I'm just going to find some other hotel or some other something and freaking chillax. Like, F all you people, this is a retreat. No. Like, I don't get paid enough for this kind of thing. So, all of a sudden, Harris is to try to go with the bus, and the bus is taking off. So it's like, well, I guess I'm stuck with you people then. So eventually we have Steve, who just ends up whipping it out within the forest. We end up seeing his cheeks, his succulent cheeks. God, that was awful. Anyways, why do we have to see the man's batonkus? Like, why do we have to see the rump maker? I don't know. It's a part of the film. So this guy is whipping it out, and he's high on mushrooms. And so he ended up getting scared because he ended up thought he saw something while he was peeing. And so he had to let everybody know. And so everybody ran to him, and now they see him basically with his twig and berries and his batonkus just flailing in the wind. And they're like, come on, man. Like, freaking, like, pull your pants up or something. Like, freaking finish whatever you're doing. Just come on. So what they end up doing is they end up taking this rope and they end up tying, once Steve is finally done, they end up tying a rope to Steve's hands to just kind of pull him like a dog in a leash to wherever they're going, because this guy is so high. So eventually, once they make it further down the road, eventually they find a something that looks like a place to quite possibly be a bread and breakfast-ish like place, but reasonably, it doesn't have any signs. There is no real, like, it looks freaking disheveled. It looks like this place is falling apart. And so immediately we start having people that are just to say, like, yeah, this is a luxury Airbnb? I don't think so. Nope. So, but eventually these guys are just like, well, hey, like, let's just stay here for X amount of days. And if nothing seems quite right, then we'll leave. Like, here's also the funny thing. Once they go here, there's no one to serve them. There's no one to just say, like, well, you have reservations? No, there's nobody like that at all. This place is deserted. So, like, nobody's asking any questions. Nobody's like, are we sure that we even have the right place? So everybody is to eventually just kind of bunker down, and everyone is to start to either get some sleep or some something. We have a spot where Steve is kind of having an out-of-body experience, where, like, Steve all of a sudden is to see another variation of Steve, and, like, so Steve is just kind of like, hey, and Steve's like, hey, and then eventually Steve's, the other out-of-body experience, Steve goes out of this little Airbnb, and all of a sudden sees another version of Steve. And all of a sudden, this version of Steve is kind of watching other people just kind of walking around this complex. Because we eventually have Harris, who is just kind of wanting to just kind of look around, and eventually he ends up finding this other little shed thing that is to seemingly have certain files about insane people. And so eventually he's starting to check that all out. So eventually, sometime later, we have Gordon, who is kind of the like I don't want to put a label on this guy, but it kind of feels like this guy is too happy for his own good. I kind of see this guy as being like the brown noser of the group, where like he's easy to please. Let's just say is the real thing that I wanted to say here, and all these other people are just like, dude, like if I'm gonna be here, like there should have been like a lot better circumstances. So, but yeah, so Gordon is kind of this easy to please character, and so he ends up making or baking supposedly a pie that has just been left out, and so all of a sudden we have this entire group eventually. Oh, uh, yeah, let's cover this, and then I'll get to the stuff when everybody was to start falling asleep. Richard eventually was to go on his own, and evidently he was to have this like wheel of bread or wheel of cheese. To me, I couldn't quite make out what kind of food he was eating. I think it looked like bread. Like to me, it looked like bread, but it could be a wheel of cheese. Weirdly, just because I couldn't clearly make it out. I think it was cheese. I'm gonna say it's cheese, but I'm sure I'm wrong. People are like, oh no, I've seen that kind of bread. It's bread, and I'm like, oh, okay, thank you, because this is from some other. This is from some other unfamiliar spot of weird stuff that I'm probably not familiar with as far as food goes for everything. So it might be cheese. So let's say it's cheese, so I can just be done with this. So the guy's eating cheese. He ends up falling asleep. He has a dream where all of a sudden he is to supposedly see Maggie, and all she's wearing is panties. And so Maggie is telling Richard, like, hey, take me, Richard, take me now. And so all of a sudden, Richard is like, well, just okay, I guess. So Richard goes closer and closer to Maggie to eventually have the person who is Maggie start to turn their head, and we end up finding out that it's bizarrely Harris in panties instead. And it's just like, and then he ends up saying like some kind of like comment, which all of a sudden leads Richard to just start stabbing Harris repetitiously with this knife he had when he was going and cutting his supposed cheese, let's just say. But then we find out that that is just some weird, bizarrish dream sequence that is to either be had by Richard or is to be had by Steve, who is still technically high. So, anyways, we push on to everyone is going, and everyone is left who is still awake is to go on and eat some of this weird pie. And so everyone is to start having their thoughts about what this place actually is. One scenario was to be that Harris was to mention that supposedly this originally was an insane asylum, and eventually all the inmates took control of the insane asylum and started locking up all the guards and everything like that were a part of this. And we rarely have some guard that is kind of roaming around through this asylum that looks kind of like like the old black and white kind of Dracula, where like he used to have where he used to be bald and he had these long ears and these huge long nails. Because this part of this movie was done in like black and white, weirdly. Because Harris was to make a point of like, yeah, like remember those old fashioned movies where women used to not say very much because Jill is kind of being a little snippy. So Harris is to say that this is an old asylum, and so Steve is to mention that this is probably uh, some kind of weird sex like nursing home where you had all these nurses that were desperate to eventually get touched or feeled by a man, but the only men that were to be at this, of course, nursing home were old guys that, of course, couldn't get it up. And so every single one of these nurses just eventually got so upset that they were almost going to go and go after one another. And then eventually some magical man arrived that was to be the owner of this elderly home that was young, and so like all of a sudden all these nurses just wanted to go after this one man. Like they tied him up and just went after him supposedly in an XES like fashion. So it's like, ooh, we get a little tease there again. And so, but yeah, everybody is supposedly having an idea of what had really happened here. Everybody's putting their 2 cents in, and uh, I'm trying to think if there was another story there bound to happen, right? So eventually, while people are to continue to eat this pie, this very absurdly delicious pie, all of a sudden we have Steve, who eventually is to spit out this tooth from when he was to eat this pie. And everybody's like, ew! So everybody is starting to gag. Everybody's starting to just be like, oh my god. And like some people were thinking that that was to either be Steve's tooth or it was to just be like, hey, maybe that's the tooth of a cow. And it's like, I'm sorry, like a tooth of a cow doesn't have molars. And so now they're starting to question with Gordon, like, hey, where did you find this pie? And he's like, it was just sitting out. Like, I just thought I would just bake it and bake it for an hour, and I thought, like, everything would be fine. And they're like, yeah, like, maybe we should not eat any of the food that's reasonably here, unless it's, like, canned goods or something, because, like, freaking, like, evidently there was something in that pie. I don't know what it is, but, like, freaking, like, who knows? So everybody just lost their appetite after finally being able to find some food to eat. They end up finding out that, yeah, gross. So, and everybody's just kind of spitting out this pie. So, eventually everyone is to start to go to sleep. Everyone start to go to bed. And so, eventually we have Jill, who is to be the other female of the group. It seems that eventually she is to go out and eventually go into the bathroom, try to get some water. Seems like a challenging thing. She ends up going and drinking some water. She ends up kind of bizarrely going and looking at her mirror to eventually see that there is to be a spider crawling upon her shoulder. And so Jill isn't afraid of spiders. She ends up kind of picking it up, and she ends up putting it out of her window to eventually find that there's some booger man, there's some goofy guy out of her window. And so Jill screams, "Ah, I'm scared!" And so everybody starts running to her room, and Jill is like, somebody was out there. And so Richard is like, well, okay, like, since you saw this person, then like Richard like has seemingly diddly worth of ideas or plans of what the heck they're to really do. So Richard is just to say, well, how about we do this? How about, Jill, you sleep on it, Jill, and then if there's anything else that is to come up or happen or whatever, or like you still feel like you don't feel safe here, then we'll leave. There was also this spot where Steve was to go and whip it out and pee, and he was to actually be peeing on some body that had been buried. because we end up seeing a little piece of like a face or something like that. So so eventually the next day, Jill is like, okay, I still feel unsafe, and so Richard is just like, well, okay, like like so really what Richard decides, he's like, well, okay, how about we do this? How about both Harris and both Jill go out to find people? Go out to like the, I guess, the roads or whichever, and try to like kind of flag down help or whatever, or try to get a cell phone signal or something. And while they're doing that, we're gonna go out and do some team building exercises because they're gonna go out and do paintball. So let's focus on Harris and Jill going off. So Harris and Jill are to go off, and so bizarrely Harris is to at some point they're to talk about like beheadings and stuff like that. Weirdly, for some reason, and so Harris is to mention like that a beheading is probably the worst thing that you could possibly do to somebody because 2 to 3 minutes after this person is to be dead, they're to still kind of move their head or just be seemingly alive for a couple of minutes and then they die. It's the worst like punishment I guess you could give somebody. So like I can't really like man, like if you're gonna die, like have it be like the easiest way possible. Have it be the easiest way possible. So you immediately die, you feel nothing, instead of having to be the most gruesome way possible. So uh so Jill and so Harris are just kind of walking along, and so there's this weird moment where I think Harris is kind of looking at Jill up and down like like I think it's some moments like, but I think that's probably just me. uh so we further go along into this thing to eventually have both Harris and both Jill eventually to get grabbed and to get killed off because there is to eventually be some um oh no, wait. uh, they have to get to the bus first. Yeah, they have to get to the bus. So, because they have to bring the bus back, and then everybody gets on the bus, and then yeah, okay. So we'll get to that. So both Harris and both Jill are to make their way down the road to eventually find this bus with a dead bus driver in it. So they take the bus uh, and they make their way back to the retreat. So these guys are going and doing paintball. It seems that eventually, it seems both Billy and both Steve are kind of on this one team, and then there's three other people like doing their side of things. So Billy is talking about how like maybe like Maggie is like maybe he's like falling for her or something like that, or maybe he's falling for one of the girls here, and so Steve is like, great, I could care less. So so eventually, what ends up happening is that it seems that one person is to eventually try and cheat, because it seems Steve and Billy were to shoot and take down one person, but we eventually find that there is no paint on the other opposite end of the of people. So eventually, both Billy and Steve just kind of rush out to try to get one of their coworkers to eventually get hit and eventually get killed. Uh, Even though they are to, I think, get at one point to capture this flag. So, uh, so eventually there is to be one side that is won, and so eventually Gordon goes into the fray and is to all of a sudden Everyone is to want to just turn on Gordon and is to just want to hit him and pelt him with paintballs. And Gordon ends up saying like, "Hey man, like don't hit me with paintballs. Like could probably get hit in the eye, and like it could be awful." So Gordon all of a sudden starts walking and eventually ends up having his leg fall into this bear trap. So both Steve and Billy are trying to get uh, Gordon's leg out of this bear trap, and they try to open this thing up, but they consistently have it to where the bear trap ends up continually closing upon Gordon's leg because Gordon cannot get his leg out of this bear trap. So eventually, Gordon's leg just comes off, just comes like flying off, and so Gordon falls, and so now they're trying to put like belts and stuff like that to stop the bleeding of Gordon, and so eventually we come back to have both Harris and Jill come back with this bus. And so now they're going and taking Gordon's leg and putting it into the freezer of this bus to say, okay, like it's time for us to just get the heck out of here. There's too many traps around here. There's too many things that can go wrong. And we just need to get the heck out of here now. This place just doesn't seem safe. So eventually we have the group all go onto this bus and they're thinking, yeah, we're going to get the heck out of here now. All of a sudden, there is to be this trap ahead of this group that is to basically pop every single one of the tires, and then the bus goes flying. And so that eventually ends up having certain characters like Jill and certain characters like Harris, where Harris ends up getting his head chopped off, and Jill ends up getting tied to this tree, and then she ends up getting gas poured onto her, and she ends up getting lit up, basically called a witch. So, by this kind of terrorist-ish like guy. So, eventually we get where the group is just like, well, F it, like, since the bus is basically a bus now, is a bust. Bust, moving on. So, Richard decides, well, since that whole thing went horribly awry, they are now just deciding, well, since we can't really get out of here quite that easily, let's go back to the Airbnb, the little place, and we'll just bunker down there, and we'll just kind of like close all the doors and lock everything up and just hold out there. Yeah, just let the killers just take their time to get to you. Take their sweet, sweet time to just eventually get to you, because it's bound to happen eventually. But, like, either way, you're gonna die, right? So, eventually, we get the group making it back to the cabin, and so eventually everyone is just starting to think, dude, Gordon is freaking dead. Like, and so Steve remembers that the leg is in that bus freezer, and so Steve is like, ah, crap. Well, I forgot Gordon's leg. Sorry, man. So these guys are bunkering down in this thing, and so obviously Gordon is just to eventually just bleed out. Like, there's no way to save this guy. And evidently they're not going to have some like hot iron or something like that to just kind of like stop the bleeding of the wound, because evidently they don't have that somewhere. Like, torch the freaking leg or what, even though that's horrible, like it'll stop the bleeding quickly. Like, they didn't come up with that. They just slapped a belt around this guy's leg. So so we get these characters that are just kind of like basically waiting to die, and eventually Steve is to give Gordon like ecstasy just so that way it could probably just kind of take the edge off of this guy's pain that he has. So eventually what ends up happening while people aren't looking is one of the terrorist guys are to grab Gordon and to take him down below somewhere to carve into his chest the anti-terrorist symbol. And eventually, when the people come back to try and find Gordon, they're like, "Where's Gordon?" And all of a sudden, they start looking for him to eventually find him being carved up. So eventually, these people try to attack this guy, but eventually they end up just going like, "Dude, we need to get the heck out of here. We need to eventually start hiding out. So eventually, like this guy won't go and kill us." So slowly but surely, we really just have these people like their only real defense against a guy with guns and flamethrowers and whatever are knives that they conveniently have. And eventually, one of the killers was to have a machete that Mackie eventually was to get from them. So, and these guys have guns. Like these guys have like AK-47s and all kinds of things. Eventually, so so eventually we have certain people who end up falling through parts of this. Uh, like we have one of the terrorist guys who ends up falling through one of the floors of this Airbnb or whatever, because eventually there is this like chintzy piece of wood, and so all of a sudden this guy just falls through the floor, and that's how they end up killing this guy is because like an unexpected like this guy falls through the floor. So like it's kind of like a like the current remake of the movie It, where the guy just falls through the floor. It's like, oh, okay, let's kill him so that way he can like because he's caught off guard. So eventually these people decide like, hey, let's just freaking make a run for it. We're probably gonna die. Like at some point, Billy, sadly enough, is to get shot in the chest in this whole like thing, and so Maggie is to basically be with Billy as Billy is to die. So everybody just runs off willy nilly into the forest, and so eventually Richard is to just kind of like I don't give a about anybody. I'm gonna run out in the forest and see what happens to me. So eventually Richard runs all the way out to the forest to eventually step on a mine, and he's like, "Oh crap!" And evidently that he had the mine that he had stepped on is one of his own companies. So he's like, "Yeah, like so." Evidently, I stepped on my own company's mine, so I know exactly that I'm going to die. So, eventually, the only people that are really and truly left at this point easily, because everyone is to eventually die, is to be Maggie and Steve, because pretty much everyone else is eventually going to die at some point, with the exclusion of hot women, because hot women. Anyways, so and I'll get to that. Uh, so both Steve and Maggie are to decide, like, well, heck, like, let's go out in the forest as well. Like, this, uh, like, the place that we're in is eventually going to be a spot where people are going to come in and try to kill us. So it's like a moot point to try and weigh out things here. Like, we had one point where, like, Steve was to hide out in this, like, armoire, this little closet thing to eventually try and get at one of these guys while he wasn't looking. So, but yeah, so Steve and Mackie run off to the woods to eventually find their boss, Richard, who is just to be like, yeah, I'm on this mine. So if anything, just kind of follow where my steps were and get the heck out of here and just continue try to like walk to wherever there is a safe spot. And so both Maggie and Steve eventually run off further on. And so eventually these terrorist guys are like, ha ha ha, like this stupid guy walked into one of these mines. And so the terrorists are to decide like, well, we're just gonna walk over onto this log and we'll be fine. So Richard is to eventually wait for the last two guys to eventually set off this mine to kill two of the other bad guys off. So at least like Richard is giving these other people a fighting chance because he's already dead anyways. So both Maggie and Steve make their way to this other Airbnb, coincidentally. And so both Steve and Maggie make their way to George and these two women that, of course, we end up seeing in the very beginning of this film. So, like, now we're going, like, full circle to eventually tell us, like, okay, what was that beginning scene? Because now we see it later on in the film, just like, oh, so that's so, like, they're covering, like, the end of this film in the beginning, okay? So Maggie and Steve are telling George, like, hey, man, we need to get the heck out of here. We're bound to eventually have these terrorists come and get us. And so you need to, like, come with us or you're going to die. Like, get all the that you need and let's get the heck out of here. So Steve is like, well, luckily for you guys, like, I've been wanting to test out this bazooka and, like, we're going to take these guys out. And, like, Steve and Maggie are like, yeah, bazooka, this is cool. So so George goes and takes this bazooka, and he's like, okay, them? And they're like, yeah. And so George goes and does this bazooka, and of course it's a bazooka that malfunctions because it's a prototype of something. So all of a sudden this bazooka goes like flying off to almost hit the guys, but then rockets all the way up to the sky and does nothing. And so they're like, oh shit. So, so both Steve and Maggie just decide, like, I guess we're just gonna be running off again into the forest, because what else can we do? So George and his two women, Olga and Nadia, are also just running off, like we kind of see in the very beginning of the movie. And so eventually what ends up happening is, so Maggie is to eventually get hooked upon this rope trap, and she's screaming for Steve. And Steve is really busy, like having to try and kill off like 2 to 3 guys, seemingly. And there is to be oh wait, so Steve eventually stabs one guy in the butt, like in the, like, not in like cheeks. I'm talking about in the place that no one should ever get stabbed. He just stabs him right in the poo poo maker, let's just say. And I'm just, oh my god, I'm like, that is some awful thing to do to a person. And so what makes it also worse is, like, Steve tries to trip this guy again, shoving this knife further up the poo poo maker spot. And I'm just like, ow, freaking, like, yeah, it's a movie. I get it. So eventually, Steve, with the guy that has a blade up his butt, is to eventually chuck a knife at Steve and hits him kind of like somewhere here, like somewhere by like shoulder blade or somewhere by like. Obviously, that's not like the heart situation, but it seems to be that he's bleeding out quite profusely when he takes the blade out. So Steve is trying to shoot all kinds of guys because eventually he ends up grabbing a gun from one of them, starts shooting them all down. I think he has like an AK-47 or something like that, a machine gun of sorts. So he ends up starts shooting a couple guys down, killing them, and eventually he is to conveniently, once taking his blade out, ends up finding the Olga and Nadia girl, who now, like, the taller of the two girls is to have her top off, and Steve is like, ah. So he is to help him. He is to help them get out of whatever this is, and so eventually that is to figure out where Maggie is, because Maggie's all tied up in this rope trap, and eventually the bad guy is to eventually cut this girl's rope to eventually try to just like continue to like like tease her, or to try to like hit her, or to just try to knock her out, to eventually then do whatever he wants with this woman. But Maggie is tough, so eventually she, like, even when she gets hit, she ends up waking up quickly and then defending herself. So eventually Maggie gets the upper hand on this guy and eventually kills him. And so Maggie just runs off to this seemingly other compound of sorts, or this kind of this area of sorts, where she ends up finding a huge number of boxes that are all from her company that I guess were to be all these weapons that these terrorists were to use against them. So Maggie ends up trying to get this phone, and so she's like, "Hey, I need help. I need help. I'm like, do you speak English?" And the operator's like, "Yeah," and like so. This girl needs help, and she's being put on hold. All of a sudden, you have this da 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 kind of music on there, the like elevator music, and so she's just like, "F it." So she chucks the phone and she walks off to eventually be met by this like flamethrower esh like guy. And so then Maggie is just like, dude, I'm gonna be freaking dead soon. And so like we have this kind of like old Wild West kind of showdown between these two. And but then so all of a sudden Steve and his half naked women come to the rescue because we have the taller of the two girls that is to be having this gun, who ends up shooting up this flamethrower-ish like guy who kills him off. And so now, considering all of the threats are to be supposedly killed off, all these people end up deciding to eventually go upon this boat and then just go and like raft their way to safety, or like row their way to safety, let's just say. And so bizarrely, we have Steve who ends up turning to Maggie and it's like, "Hey, foursome," and she's like whatever, like it's just like, are you kidding me? Like we almost died. Uh, but yeah, so at the end of all this, there was supposedly a happy ending, but we don't know. Um, Basically, it just ends with this movie just having these women and all these people rowing off to safety, and that's all we know. They could have easily just killed everyone off, and that would have been good, or they could have just had it where eventually, like, seemingly everybody got out okay. But that's not bound to happen in a horror film. So with that said, that is basically Severance, an hour and 25-minute movie, which I almost got to the hour mark. So I apologize for how long this took. But with that said, I'm gonna get the heck out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.